How many times can God warn a people before finally allowing what he had foretold for generations to happen? For centuries, there were men who would discover the answer in the hardest possible way. They stood before kings and said what no one else dared to say. They warned cities that were convinced they were safe. They watched as war, invasion, and destruction drew closer while the people around them chose to call them liars rather than consider that they might be right. And some paid a terrible price simply for delivering the message. What makes their story even more unsettling is that many of those warnings eventually came true. Kingdoms that seemed untouchable fell. Cities that believed they were protected were conquered. Israel was destroyed. Jerusalem was left in ruins. And the temple that once seemed impossible to lose was burned to the ground. The prophets had warned them for generations. And yet every time one of those warnings came true, something strange happened. God sent another prophet. And perhaps that is where the true story of the prophets begins. Because if their only purpose had been to warn people about what was coming, their story should have ended when those warnings finally came true. But it didn't. Even among the ruins, the prophets continued to speak. Only now they began to announce something different. Their message was no longer only about what God would destroy. It began to speak of what he promised to restore one day. And to understand why that message changed, we have to go back to the beginning. Before we begin, if you enjoy stories like this, you can support the channel by leaving a like or subscribing. But only if you genuinely want to. And if you have a moment, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. Reading through those comments is always one of the best parts. Now let's go back to the beginning. Long before there were men known as Isaiah, Jeremiah, or Ezekiel, the Bible was already shaping the role of the prophet. And in the beginning, that role was far less clearly defined than it would become centuries later. A prophet was not simply someone who could predict future events. A prophet was someone called to deliver a message that was not his own. Sometimes that message carried a promise. Other times it carried a warning. And sometimes it forced the messenger to confront the very people who had the power to destroy him. One of the first men the Bible calls a prophet is Abraham. That might seem surprising. We usually remember Abraham as the man of the promise. The man who left his homeland, waited decades for a son, and became the ancestor of a nation. But his story introduces something fundamental. God speaks, and a human being must respond. That pattern will become the foundation for everything that follows. But to find the man who truly begins to shape the role of the prophet, we need to move forward several generations. Abraham's family has ended up in Egypt. At first they came looking for food. Then the rulers changed. The years passed. And the descendants of that family eventually became slaves. Then a child named Moses is born. His story begins under a sentence of death. Pharaoh has ordered the male children of the Hebrews to be killed. Moses' mother manages to hide him for a time. But eventually she places the child in a small basket and leaves him among the reeds of the Nile. The future prophet begins his life unable to save himself. He is found by Pharaoh's daughter. He grows up within the Egyptian world. And for years he seems far closer to the palace than to the destiny that will eventually define him. But Moses knows that he belongs to another people. One day he sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He intervenes. He kills the Egyptian. And when what he has done becomes known, he is forced to flee. The man who will one day stand before Pharaoh begins by running away from him. Moses reaches Midian. There he builds another life. He marries. He tends flocks. The years pass. Egypt grows distant. And if you had met Moses during those years, you probably would not have seen a future prophet. You would have seen a shepherd growing older far from the place where his story began. Then one day, while leading the flock through the wilderness, he notices something strange. A bush is burning, but it is not being consumed. Moses moves closer, and from the fire he hears his name. Moses, Moses. What he hears next will change not only his life, but the way the Bible understands prophets for generations to come. God tells him that he has seen the suffering of Israel. He has heard their cries, and he is going to deliver them. Up to this point, everything might sound like extraordinary news for Moses, until he discovers who must carry the message. Him. He must return to Egypt. He must stand before Pharaoh. And he must tell the most powerful man in that world to let his slaves go. Moses responds the way almost anyone might respond. Who am I to do something like this? It does not sound like false humility. Moses knows Egypt. He knows the power of Pharaoh. And he probably knows his own limitations just as well. Then comes another objection. What if Israel does not believe him? Then another. Moses says he is not a good speaker. Words do not come easily to him. It is difficult to imagine a less perfect introduction for one of the greatest prophets in the Bible. The man chosen to speak insists that he cannot speak. But here we learn something that will follow almost every prophet who comes after him. The authority of a prophet does not depend primarily on who the messenger is. It depends on who sent him. Moses does not have to invent the message. He has to deliver it. And that is exactly what he does. He returns to Egypt. He goes back to the place he once fled. And eventually he stands before Pharaoh. The man standing before him is no longer simply a shepherd. He is a messenger. And the message is direct. Let my people go. Pharaoh refuses. So Moses returns. Pharaoh refuses again. And this begins one of the most important patterns in the entire prophetic story. The message comes. Those in power reject it. The warning grows more severe. And there is still an opportunity to listen. But with every rejection, the consequences move a little closer. Long before Jeremiah. Long before Jerusalem. Long before the exile. Moses is already facing the problem that will follow the prophets for centuries. What does a messenger of God do when the person who needs to listen is absolutely convinced that he can ignore the message? Pharaoh responds by making life even harder for the slaves. For the Israelites, this must have been difficult to understand. Moses had arrived promising freedom. But after his arrival, life seems to get worse. Now they have to do the same amount of work with fewer resources. The overseers beat them. And some begin to see Moses not as the man who will save them, but as the man responsible for making their suffering worse. That moment reveals another uncomfortable truth about being a prophet. Delivering the right message does not guarantee that people will understand you. Sometimes not even the people that message is meant to help. Moses finds himself caught between two forms of rejection. Pharaoh refuses to listen, and his own people are beginning to lose faith in him. But Moses returns to Pharaoh. Then the plagues begin. The water of the Nile turns to blood. Then come frogs, gnats, flies. Livestock dies. Disease spreads. Hail falls. Locusts arrive. Darkness covers the land. Each blow increases the pressure. But each one also brings another opportunity. Pharaoh can give in. He can listen. He can let the people go. At times it seems as though he might. When the pressure becomes unbearable, he calls for Moses. He makes promises. He negotiates. He asks for the plague to end. But as soon as relief comes, he resists again. And here we see something that will appear many times later in the story. The problem is not always that people fail to understand the warning. Sometimes they understand it perfectly. They simply do not want to accept what it requires of them. Pharaoh knows exactly what Moses is asking. But obedience would mean giving something up. It would mean surrendering control. It would mean recognizing an authority greater than his own. And that is precisely what he refuses to do. Finally, the last plague comes. The death of the firstborn. That night changes Egypt. Pharaoh finally allows Israel to leave. The message he rejected again and again is now accompanied by the consequence he had been given so many chances to avoid. And the Israelites leave. But the story of Moses as a prophet is only beginning. Because now he is about to discover something perhaps even more painful. It would have been easy to believe that the great problem was inside Pharaoh's palace. It wasn't. Israel crosses the sea. They watch the army pursuing them disappear behind them. They are free. And soon afterward they begin to complain. There is not enough water. There is not enough food. The journey is difficult. Some even begin to remember Egypt as though slavery had been better than the uncertainty of the wilderness. Moses no longer has to speak only against a king who refuses to listen. Now he must speak to the very people who have just been set free. They arrive at Mount Sinai. And there something happens that will shape the entire story of the prophets. Israel enters into a covenant. They receive commandments. They are given a way to live as a people. And with that covenant come consequences. Blessing if they remain faithful. Disaster if they abandon what they have received. This matters because centuries later, when the prophets warn of invasion, famine, defeat, and exile, they will not be inventing new threats. They will be reminding Israel of a warning that is much older. Moses had already told them where unfaithfulness could lead. And he had warned them about something even more dangerous. The people would enter a land. They would build homes. They would have food. They would prosper. And that was precisely when they might forget. Not during slavery. Not necessarily during hunger. When everything was going well. Because comfort could accomplish what Pharaoh never could. It could make Israel forget who had set them free. If you had listened to Moses during those final years, you would have heard words that would later sound familiar in the mouths of almost every great prophet. Remember. Do not forget. Listen. Return. Simple words. But much of Israel's later tragedy will grow from its inability to do exactly that. Moses grows old. He knows he will not accompany the people through everything that lies ahead. And before he dies, he announces that one day God will raise up another prophet like him. Israel must listen to him. The idea is left open. Because Moses has done something no earlier figure had done in quite the same way. He confronted a king. He delivered the words of God. He performed signs. He interceded for the people. He warned them about the consequences of abandoning the covenant. And he stood between God and a nation that often refused to listen. The model has been established. But after Moses, something inevitable happens. The generation changes. Those who saw Egypt eventually die. Those who crossed the wilderness disappear. And new generations inherit a land whose liberation they never witnessed. Then the very thing Moses feared begins to happen. Israel begins to forget. And when that happens, God once again needs messengers. Only this time, some of them will not have to stand against foreign pharaohs. They will have to stand against Israel's own leaders. After the death of Moses, Israel finally enters the promised land. Joshua leads the initial conquest. The tribes begin to settle. And for a time, it might seem that the great warnings of the wilderness will no longer be necessary. But human memory is short. One generation passes, then another. And a cycle begins that will repeat itself for years. Israel turns away from God. The people adopt the religious practices of the nations around them. Oppression follows. The people cry out. God raises up a deliverer. Rescue comes. And after a while, the entire cycle begins again. The book of Judges is filled with this repetition. Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. Very different people appear in moments of crisis. Some act with extraordinary courage. Others are deeply flawed and full of contradictions. But none of them manages to break the cycle. Israel can be rescued from an enemy. What no one seems able to do is stop the people from turning away again. And toward the end of this period, the situation grows increasingly dark. Then Samuel appears. His story begins when Israel still has no king. Samuel is only a child when he is brought to the sanctuary to serve under Eli the priest. One night he hears a voice. He thinks Eli is calling him. So he gets up and goes to him. But Eli did not call. Samuel lies down again. The voice returns. Samuel gets up again. And eventually Eli realizes what is happening. God is calling the boy. But notice the first major message Samuel receives. It is not a comforting promise. It is not a vision of prosperity. It is a warning against the household of the very man who has cared for him. Eli's sons have abused their position as priests. And judgment is coming. Samuel has to wake the next morning knowing something terrible about the family of his mentor. It probably would have been much easier to remain silent. But Eli wants to know what Samuel heard. So Samuel tells him. And that is how his prophetic life begins. With a message he probably wished he did not have to deliver. That detail matters. Because from Samuel onward, we begin to see something that will appear again and again. A true prophet does not control the message. He cannot soften it simply because the person standing before him is powerful. He cannot change it because he loves that person. And he cannot hide the truth simply because speaking it might destroy the relationship between them. Samuel grows older. Israel begins to recognize him as a prophet. And with time, a different kind of crisis emerges. The people want a king. They look at the nations around them. Those nations have monarchs, organized armies, visible figures of authority. Israel wants the same. Samuel warns them about the cost. A king will take their sons for his armies. He will take their daughters into his service. He will take fields, vineyards, resources. The power that seems to promise security can eventually demand a great deal from the people who surrender that power to it. But Israel insists. They want a king. Then Saul appears. At first he seems like a promising choice. He is physically impressive. He looks like the kind of man many people would expect a king to be. Samuel anoints him. And for a time, Israel has exactly what it asked for. But soon the same problem that followed the people through the wilderness appears again. Listening. Saul receives instructions, and he begins to obey them only as far as it suits him. On one occasion he offers a sacrifice instead of waiting for Samuel. On another he is commanded to carry out judgment completely against Amalek. But Saul keeps what he considers valuable. When Samuel arrives, Saul insists that he has obeyed, but the evidence around him says otherwise. Then Samuel expresses an idea that will come to define the conflict between prophets and kings. Obedience matters more than offering sacrifices to cover disobedience. Ritual cannot replace what the heart refuses to do. Then comes the message Saul least wants to hear. His kingdom will not endure. God will choose another. Imagine the scene. Samuel is standing before the first king of Israel. He was the one who anointed him. And now he has to tell Saul that something which began with so much hope is coming to an end. Saul tries to hold him back. He grabs the edge of Samuel's robe. The fabric tears. And Samuel turns even that accident into an image. In the same way, the kingdom will be torn from your hands. From that moment on, the relationship between prophet and king changes forever. Because Israel finally has its monarchs. But those monarchs will not have the final word. Beside the throne, another figure will appear. Someone who does not need a crown to confront a king. Someone who can walk into a palace and say what everyone else is too afraid to say. The prophet. And very soon, one of those prophets will have to look directly at another king of Israel and accuse him of murder. That king will be David. David does not receive this accusation while he is still a young shepherd. By this point he is already king. He has defeated his enemies. He has united the kingdom. Jerusalem has become the center of his power. And the promise of a future dynasty now rests upon his house. Then David commits one of the darkest acts of his life. From the roof of his palace, he sees a woman named Bathsheba. He asks about her. He learns that she is married to Uriah, one of his soldiers. Even so, David sends for her. Bathsheba becomes pregnant, and the king tries to hide what happened. First, he brings Uriah home from the battlefield. David hopes he will go home to his wife so no one will discover what has happened. But Uriah refuses to enjoy the comforts of home while his fellow soldiers are still fighting. David tries again. It does not work. Then he makes a far darker decision. He sends Uriah back to the war carrying a letter for Joab, the commander of the army. Inside that letter is essentially Uriah's own death sentence. David orders Joab to place Uriah where the fighting is most dangerous. Then the other soldiers are to pull back. Uriah dies. The king has managed to hide the problem. Or so he thinks. Because then a man named Nathan appears. Nathan is a prophet. And he must do something extraordinarily dangerous. He must stand before a king who has just shown how far he is willing to go to protect his secret. But Nathan does not begin with a direct accusation. Instead, he tells David a story. He speaks of a rich man who owns many flocks. And he speaks of a poor man who has only one little lamb. A lamb he has raised almost like a member of his own family. A traveler comes to visit the rich man. But the rich man refuses to take one of his own animals to prepare a meal. Instead, he takes the poor man's only lamb. David listens to the story, and he becomes furious. The king demands justice against the man who did such a thing. Then Nathan reveals the trap. "You are that man." For a moment, everything changes. David has judged the sin of another man without realizing that he has been passing judgment on himself. And Nathan begins to expose what David tried to hide. The adultery. The death of Uriah. The abuse of power. The king can command soldiers. He can issue orders. He can hide a crime from his own court. But he cannot prevent the prophet from walking into the palace with a message. David admits his sin. And although he receives forgiveness, the consequences within his own household will be severe. The royal family begins to fracture. Violence. Betrayal. Rebellion. David's own son Absalom will eventually attempt to take the throne from him. The story of Nathan establishes something that will become essential in the centuries ahead. In Israel, the king is not above the word of God. And when kings begin to forget that, the prophets will become some of the most uncomfortable people in the kingdom. After David comes Solomon. The kingdom reaches extraordinary prosperity. The temple is built. Jerusalem grows. But toward the end of his life, Solomon turns away. And after his death, the kingdom breaks apart. 10 tribes form the northern kingdom known as Israel. Judah remains in the south with Jerusalem and the line of David. From this point forward, the story becomes more complicated. 2 kingdoms, 2 lines of kings, coups, wars, alliances, and in the middle of all of it, prophets. They will become more necessary than ever, because the kings of the north quickly begin building religious systems designed to keep their people from returning to Jerusalem. Jeroboam establishes alternative places of worship. He sets up golden calves, and he presents all of it as a political solution. Religion begins to be used to protect political power. Then prophets begin appearing before altars and inside palaces. Some of them are not even given names that the Bible preserves. They arrive, they deliver a warning, and they disappear. But the pattern becomes increasingly clear. The further the kings move away, the more uncomfortable the message becomes, until Israel reaches the reign of one of its most famous kings, Ahab, and beside him Jezebel. Under their rule, the worship of Baal receives royal support. This is no longer simply a matter of individuals privately abandoning the covenant. Now the power of the kingdom itself is pushing the people in that direction. And then one of the strangest prophets in the entire Bible appears. We know nothing about his childhood. We are given no long genealogy. He simply enters the story. His name is Elijah, and his first words are already a confrontation. There will be no rain. Israel depends on rain. And Baal is worshipped as a god associated with storms and fertility. So the drought will not simply be an economic crisis. It will be a challenge. Elijah has just stepped into a battle far larger than himself. And after delivering the message, he has to disappear. He hides. First beside a stream. Then far from the territory controlled by Ahab. The years pass. The land dries out. Crops fail. Hunger spreads. And Ahab begins searching for the man he believes is responsible. It is an idea we will encounter again with other prophets. When the message becomes unbearable, it is easier to blame the messenger. But Elijah will return. And when he does, he will propose a public confrontation that will force Israel to decide who they are willing to listen to. The place will be Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel becomes the setting for a question Israel has avoided for far too long. Elijah gathers the people. Hundreds of prophets of Baal are there as well. Then Elijah gives them a challenge. How long will you keep wavering between 2 sides? If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, follow him. The people remain silent. And perhaps that silence reveals more than any answer could. Because the problem is no longer simply that Israel has completely abandoned God. They have tried to hold on to more than one loyalty at the same time. Elijah forces them to choose. 2 sacrifices are prepared. The prophets of Baal place theirs on the altar, but they are not allowed to light it. Elijah will do the same. Whichever God answers with fire will be recognized as God. The prophets of Baal begin. They call out for hours. They shout. They dance around the altar. The morning passes. Nothing happens. Elijah watches. Then his turn comes. He rebuilds an altar using 12 stones. 1 for each tribe of Israel. He places the sacrifice on it. And then he does something strange in the middle of a drought. He asks for water. They pour it over the altar. Then they do it again. And again. Everything is soaked. Then Elijah prays. He does not need hours. He does not need to shout. He asks that Israel may understand who God is and that their hearts may turn back to him. Then the fire comes. It consumes the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the water surrounding the altar. The people fall to the ground. For a moment, it seems as though the great battle is over. After years of drought, the rain finally returns. You might imagine that Elijah has reached the highest point of his mission. The people have seen. The king has seen. Baal has been publicly humiliated. What more could a prophet possibly need? Then Jezebel hears what happened, and she sends a message. Elijah will die. That is enough. The man who has just stood against hundreds of prophets runs for his life. He escapes into the wilderness. He sits beneath a tree, and there we see a completely different Elijah. He challenges no one. He calls down no fire. He gives no great speech. He is exhausted. He is afraid, and he wants to die. This moment matters because prophets can seem like giants when we remember only their miracles. But the Bible also preserves their moments of exhaustion. Elijah has obeyed. He has risked his life. He has publicly demonstrated the truth of his message. And still, Israel has not changed in the way he hoped. Jezebel still has power. The threat remains. And the prophet discovers that one spectacular victory does not automatically change the heart of a nation. God meets him there. Not with an accusation. First with rest. Then with food. Elijah sleeps. He eats. And he continues his journey. Eventually he reaches Horeb, the mountain connected with Moses and the covenant. There he takes shelter in a cave. And he hears a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? His answer is filled with frustration. He has been faithful. Israel has abandoned the covenant. They have torn down altars. They have killed prophets. And Elijah believes he is the only one left. Then a powerful wind comes. But God is not in the wind. Then an earthquake. Then fire. But the moment is leading towards something far quieter. A gentle voice. Elijah comes out. And he receives new instructions. His mission is not over. And he is not as alone as he believes. There are still people in Israel who have not bowed down to Baal. The message will continue. And part of that continuation will come through another man, Elisha. Elijah finds him working in a field. He walks past him and places his cloak over his shoulders. It is a simple moment, but its meaning is enormous. The prophet who believed everything might end with him has just found the man who will continue after him. Elisha leaves his old life behind, and he begins to follow Elijah. For a time the two walk together, until the moment comes for Elijah to leave. It does not happen like an ordinary death. Elijah is separated from Elisha in an extraordinary scene of fire and wind, and the cloak falls. Elisha picks it up. The image perfectly captures what is happening in the story. The messenger leaves. The message continues. Elisha returns toward the Jordan carrying his master's cloak. And from there, a new chapter begins. His story will be filled with miracles. Water restored. Food multiplied. The sick healed. Even the dead brought back to life. But around all those miracles, the northern kingdom continues to deteriorate. The kings change. The threats change. The problem remains. And little by little, the question is no longer whether Israel will receive another warning. The question becomes how much time remains before the thing they have been warned about finally arrives. With Elisha, the miracles multiply. But so does a contradiction. God is still at work in Israel. The prophets are still speaking. And yet the kingdom continues moving toward the very thing it has spent generations trying to avoid. Elisha lives surrounded by crisis. There are wars, famine, conflicts between kings, foreign threats. And in the middle of all this, his stories reveal something that might seem unusual for a prophet. Again and again his attention turns toward ordinary people. A widow is about to lose her sons because she cannot pay her debts. All she has in her home is a small amount of oil. Elisha tells her to gather containers. As many as she can find. The woman begins to fill them. And the oil keeps flowing. One container after another. Until there are no empty containers left. On another occasion, a woman who had been given a son after years of waiting suddenly watches that child die. She goes looking for Elisha. The prophet comes to her home. And the child is brought back to life. Then there is Naaman, a foreign commander, a powerful man. But a man suffering from leprosy. Naaman arrives perhaps expecting some impressive ritual. Elisha does not even come outside to meet him. Instead, he sends him a simple instruction. Wash 7 times in the Jordan. Naaman is offended. He expected something far more dramatic. But eventually he obeys, and he is healed. These stories might seem far removed from Israel's great political struggles. They are not. While kings search for security through armies, alliances, and power, the stories of Elisha reveal a different kind of authority. An authority that reaches into an empty kitchen, into a room where a child has died, even to a foreigner who comes looking for healing. But the miracles cannot stop the kingdom from falling apart. The problem was never a lack of signs. Israel had already seen too many of them. The problem was listening to what those signs were pointing toward. The years pass. Elisha grows old. And eventually he dies. But the kings continue. Some rule for years. Others last only a few months. There are conspiracies, assassinations. Entire families are wiped out so another can take the throne. And while Israel tears itself apart from within, something far more dangerous is growing beyond its borders. Assyria. An empire built through conquest. Its armies move against cities and kingdoms. News of their arrival creates fear long before their soldiers ever appear. And now the prophets begin to speak with a different kind of urgency. One of them is named Amos. And once again his story breaks our expectations. Amos does not belong to the religious elite of the northern kingdom. He comes from Judah. He describes himself as a man connected to livestock and the work of the land. He does not look like the kind of man a prosperous society would expect to listen to. And that is precisely what makes his message so uncomfortable. Because when Amos arrives in the north, Israel is enjoying a period of prosperity. There are impressive homes, trade, wealth, religious ceremonies. From the outside, the kingdom may appear stable. But Amos looks beneath the surface. He sees the poor being exploited. He sees corrupt judges. He sees people being sold because of debt. He sees merchants waiting impatiently for religious celebrations to end so they can get back to business. And then he delivers an accusation that must have been deeply offensive. Their ceremonies mean nothing if injustice continues to rule their lives. Israel can sing. They can offer sacrifices. They can gather in sacred places. But none of it can be used to silence the way they treat the vulnerable. Amos announces that consequences are coming. The kingdom that appears secure will not remain that way. And then something happens that we will see again with other prophets. A religious authority tries to drive him away. Amaziah, the priest of Bethel, tells Amos to leave. Go back to Judah. Prophesy there. In other words, say whatever you want. But not here. Not near the king's sanctuary. Not where your message can become a political problem. Amos responds that he did not choose this mission. He was working when God called him. Once again the same pattern appears. The prophet is not there because it is convenient. He is there because he was sent. And while Amos exposes Israel's injustice, another prophet begins to represent Israel's problem in a far more personal way. His name is Hosea. His message will not begin with an army, or with fire, or with a public confrontation on a mountain. It will begin inside his own home. Because this time the prophet will not simply have to speak the message. He will have to live it. Hosea receives a mission that is difficult before he ever speaks a single prophecy. His marriage will become part of the message. The relationship between Hosea and Gomer will be used to represent a much older relationship. The relationship between God and Israel. For generations, Israel had received protection, a land, a covenant, an identity. But again and again the people had turned to other gods. They had placed their trust in other powers. They had given to others what they had promised to keep. Earlier prophets had called this disobedience. Hosea uses a far more painful word: unfaithfulness. Suddenly, abandoning the covenant no longer looks like simply breaking a law. It looks like betraying a relationship. And the names of Hosea's children also become signs. Each one carries a difficult message: judgment, no compassion, a broken sense of belonging. Imagine what that means. The prophet cannot simply return home after delivering his message and leave it behind. His own family reminds him of what he is announcing. His private life has become a visible prophecy. But Hosea introduces a surprising tension. Because while he describes Israel's unfaithfulness in painful terms, he also presents God as someone who does not easily abandon his people. There is judgment. Yes, the consequences will come. But beneath the anger there is grief. As though the question is no longer simply what punishment Israel deserves. The question becomes how much a relationship can endure before it finally breaks. Hosea looks back into the past. He remembers Egypt. He remembers Israel as a child that God taught to walk. He remembers care, food, protection. And that is precisely why the betrayal is so serious. Israel is not rejecting a stranger. They are forgetting the one who brought them out of slavery. But even then Hosea speaks of return, of restoration, of a future in which what was broken might one day be made whole again. This combination will become increasingly important. Warning and hope, judgment and restoration. The prophets do not speak only about what is going to end. They also begin to speak about what might exist afterward. While Hosea lives out this message, another prophet receives a very different mission: Jonah. God tells him to go to Nineveh, the city associated with Assyria, the empire whose shadow is growing across the region. For an Israelite, Nineveh does not simply represent a foreign city. It represents the enemy. And Jonah does not want to go. So he does exactly the opposite. He finds a ship, and he tries to travel in the other direction. The prophet called to carry a message runs away from the message. The sea becomes violent. The crew struggles to keep the ship afloat. Eventually, Jonah admits that his attempt to escape is behind the crisis. He is thrown into the water. The sea becomes calm, and Jonah disappears beneath the surface. Then a great fish swallows him. For 3 days he remains there. The man who tried to escape his mission is now trapped in a place he cannot escape on his own. Eventually he is returned to dry land. And the command comes again. Go to Nineveh. This time Jonah goes. He walks through the city announcing that judgment is coming. And then something happens that perhaps no prophet of Israel would have expected. Nineveh listens. From ordinary people all the way to the king, the city responds. There is repentance. And the destruction Jonah announced does not come. It should be an extraordinary success. A prophet spoke. A city listened. Judgment was avoided. But Jonah is furious. That is exactly why he tried to run away. He knew what God was like. He feared that if Nineveh repented, they would receive mercy. And Jonah did not want mercy for them. He wanted justice. Now the story places the prophet beneath an uncomfortable question. Can a messenger proclaim the compassion of God while secretly wishing that some people were excluded from it? Jonah wanted to decide who deserved to hear the message. But the message was never his. And the story leaves something unsettling behind. Nineveh has received mercy. For now. Because Assyria will continue to grow. And in time, the same empire whose city once listened to a warning will become the instrument that destroys the northern kingdom. Amos had warned them. Hosea had warned them. Others had spoken as well. Israel had years to listen. But prosperity made the danger seem far away. Until it wasn't. The Assyrian armies begin to move closer. Cities fall. Territories disappear. And eventually Samaria, the capital of Israel, is surrounded. After generations of warnings, the moment that once seemed impossible has arrived. The northern kingdom is about to discover what happens when a warning is repeated for so long that everyone begins to believe it will never come true. For years, Samaria had been the center of the northern kingdom. Kings had lived there. Palaces had been built there. And from that city, decisions had been made that affected entire generations. Now Samaria is trapped. The Assyrian army surrounds the city. There is no easy way out. The siege continues. And eventually Samaria falls. The kingdom of Israel ceases to exist as it had before. Many of its people are deported. Other populations are brought into the land. Families who had lived there for generations disappear into territories controlled by an enormous empire. And suddenly, the words of the prophets no longer sound like exaggerated warnings. Amos had spoken while the kingdom was still prosperous. Hosea had described a relationship that was breaking apart. For years there had been time to listen. But the disaster came. And this changes the tone of the entire prophetic story. Until now, people could always tell themselves that perhaps the warnings would never become anything more than words. After Samaria, that illusion disappears. An entire kingdom has fallen. But Judah still exists in the south. Jerusalem is still standing. The temple is still functioning. A descendant of David still sits on the throne. And perhaps that is exactly why a dangerous idea begins to take hold. Maybe what happened in the north could never happen here. Maybe Jerusalem is different. Maybe the presence of the temple means the city is protected. Maybe the promise made to David means Jerusalem cannot be touched. This is the world in which Isaiah appears. His calling begins with a vision. King Uzziah has died. A king who ruled for decades is gone. And in the middle of that uncertainty, Isaiah sees another throne. He sees the Lord exalted. The temple fills with his presence. Heavenly beings proclaim his holiness. Isaiah does not respond by feeling powerful because he has received a vision. He is terrified. He becomes painfully aware of his own impurity. A burning coal touches his lips. Then he hears a question. Whom shall I send? Isaiah answers, Here I am. Send me. It might seem like the perfect beginning to a great mission. But Isaiah immediately discovers what kind of mission this will be. He will speak to a people who do not want to understand. And the more he speaks, the more obvious their resistance will become. Once again we return to the question we began with. Why send a prophet when the people receiving the message will probably refuse to listen? Isaiah will live inside that tension for years. And the threat dominating the great conflicts of his early ministry has a name we already know. Assyria. The empire that destroyed the northern kingdom is now moving toward Judah. Fortified cities fall. Refugees move toward Jerusalem. Fear spreads. And the kings must decide what they will trust. Armies. alliances, other empires, or the message the prophet continues to deliver. During the reign of Ahaz, Isaiah approaches a king terrified by his enemies. He tells him not to let fear control his decisions. But Ahaz looks for political solutions. He chooses to rely on Assyria. It seems reasonable. A small kingdom needs the help of a greater one. But the problem is that the power chosen as a savior will eventually become a threat. Assyria moves deeper and deeper into the region. Years later, during the reign of Hezekiah, what once seemed distant reaches the gates of Jerusalem. The Assyrian army has destroyed cities all around them. Now its representatives stand outside the capital. And they use a weapon the prophets know very well. Words. They speak loudly enough for the people on the walls to hear them. They mock Judah's confidence. They remind them of all the kingdoms Assyria has already destroyed. What God was able to save them. Why should Jerusalem be any different? Inside the city, the fear must have been overwhelming. Samaria had fallen. Other cities in Judah had fallen as well. This enemy is not making an empty threat. It has a long record of victories behind it. Hezekiah turns to Isaiah. And the prophet delivers a message very different from the one earlier kings had refused to hear. Do not be afraid. Jerusalem will not fall into the hands of Assyria. This time the king listens, and the city survives. The enemy army withdraws after disaster strikes its camp. For those who lived through that moment, the lesson must have seemed obvious. Listening to the prophet had mattered. Jerusalem had been preserved. But even such an extraordinary deliverance could become dangerous. Because later generations would remember that Jerusalem had survived. They would remember that the temple stood there. They would remember the promises. And little by little, some would turn that memory into a dangerous certainty. Jerusalem can never fall. The temple can never be destroyed. God will always save us in the end. Decades later, another prophet will have to walk into that very temple and say something almost no one will be willing to hear. This time he will not promise that Jerusalem will be saved. He will say that it can be destroyed. His name will be Jeremiah. Jeremiah enters the story at a strange moment. Assyria, the empire that had terrified earlier generations, is beginning to weaken. For Judah that might seem like good news. The enemy that destroyed the northern kingdom is no longer as powerful as it once was. But another power is rising. Babylon. And Jeremiah will spend much of his life trying to convince Jerusalem that the real danger is still ahead. His calling begins when he is young. Too young, at least in his own eyes. When God tells him that he has been chosen to speak to the nations, Jeremiah responds that he does not know how to speak. The objection sounds familiar. It reminds us of Moses. Once again, a future prophet looks first at his own limitations. And once again, the answer is not to turn him into someone naturally powerful. The message will not depend on that. Jeremiah must speak the words he is given. And his mission includes difficult words. To uproot, to tear down, to destroy, but also to build, and to plant. From the beginning, judgment and restoration appear together. But for many years, the first will be much easier to see than the second. Jeremiah walks through Jerusalem and sees a city that is still functioning. There are merchants, priests, homes, walls. The temple is still standing. The ceremonies continue. And that is precisely the problem. Many people have begun to treat the existence of the temple as a guarantee. As long as that building remains among them, they believe Jerusalem will be safe. Then Jeremiah receives a dangerous command. He must stand near the entrance to the temple, right where the people pass as they come to worship. And he must tell them that the building will not save them. They cannot oppress the foreigner, the orphan, the widow. They cannot shed innocent blood. They cannot follow other gods. And then walk into the temple believing that a sacred place will erase everything they have done. Jeremiah points them toward an uncomfortable memory, Shiloh, an ancient place of worship that had been destroyed. If it happened there, it can happen here. The message strikes directly at one of Jerusalem's deepest convictions. This temple can fall. The priests and other leaders react. Jeremiah is accused. Some want him dead. And so begins a life in which speaking the truth will leave him with fewer and fewer places where he can feel safe. But Jeremiah continues. Sometimes he speaks. Sometimes he uses objects. On one occasion, he carries a yoke across his shoulders. The image is impossible to ignore. Judah will have to submit to the rule of Babylon. To many people, that sounds like betrayal. How can a prophet of God tell the nation to accept the power of a foreign empire? Other prophets offer a far more comforting message. They say Babylon will soon be defeated. The objects taken from the temple will return. The crisis will end. One of those prophets is Hananiah. He confronts Jeremiah in public. He takes the yoke from Jeremiah's shoulders. He breaks it, and he announces that the power of Babylon will be broken in the same way. Imagine standing among the people watching. Two men. Two completely different messages. Both claim to speak in the name of God. One promises a quick deliverance. The other says difficult years are coming. Which one would you want to believe? Probably the one who tells you everything will be fine. That was one of the most painful problems the true prophets faced. They were not competing only against disbelief. They were also competing against religious messages that told people exactly what they wanted to hear. Jeremiah refuses to change his message. The crisis will not end quickly. Babylon is coming. And as he continues to speak, his position becomes more dangerous. He is beaten. He is placed in stocks. He is mocked. His words are treated as a threat to the morale of the people. At one point, Jeremiah even curses the day he was born. Not because he has stopped believing the message, but because carrying it has become unbearable. He tries to remain silent, but he describes the word inside him as a fire. He cannot hold it in. And perhaps this is one of the most painful portraits of a prophet in the entire story. A man who no longer wants to speak, the people who no longer want to hear him, and a message he cannot walk away from. Then Babylon begins to move closer. What had been a warning for years is beginning to become reality. And Jerusalem still believes it will find a way to escape. The first major deportation takes place before the final destruction. Babylon enters Jerusalem and carries away part of the population. Among those taken far from Judah are priests, nobles, young people, and families who now have to learn how to live in a foreign land. But Jerusalem still exists. The temple is still standing. And that allows a dangerous hope to survive. Maybe everything will return to normal soon. Maybe Babylon will withdraw. Maybe the exiles will come home within a few months. Jeremiah sends a letter to those very people. And once again his message is uncomfortable. Build houses, plant crops, raise families. Seek the well-being of the city where you now live. Not because Babylon has become your permanent home, but because the exile will be long. 70 years. For someone who has just lost their homeland, those words carry a devastating meaning. Many of the people who left Jerusalem will not live long enough to return. Jeremiah is tearing down another false hope. But at the same time, he begins to speak some of the most extraordinary promises of his entire life. A day will come when God will make a new covenant. It will not simply be an outward repetition of what Israel had already received. The law will be written on the heart. The relationship that generations had broken again and again will require a much deeper transformation. This idea changes the direction of prophecy. For centuries, the message had been simple. Listen, obey, return. But Israel kept showing that the problem could not be solved by another warning alone. Something within the people themselves needed to change. While Jeremiah speaks of these things, the political situation grows worse. Jerusalem rebels against Babylon. The army of Nebuchadnezzar returns. The city is surrounded. Hunger begins to spread. And Jeremiah continues saying something that many consider intolerable. Jerusalem will fall. Surrender is the only way to survive. To the military leaders, this no longer sounds like prophecy. It sounds like cooperation with the enemy. So they seize Jeremiah. They lower him into a cistern. There is no water inside, only mud. And the prophet begins to sink. After spending so many years warning Jerusalem, Jeremiah ends up trapped beneath the very city he is trying to save. Then an official named Ebed-Melech intervenes. Jeremiah is pulled out with ropes. He survives. But the siege continues. And eventually the moment comes. The Babylonians break through the walls. King Zedekiah tries to escape during the night. He is captured. His sons are executed in front of him. Then he is blinded. The last thing he sees is the destruction of his own family. Jerusalem falls into the hands of Babylon. And then something happens that had seemed impossible for years. The temple burns. The palace burns. The houses burn. The walls are torn down. More people are taken into exile. Jeremiah had spent years warning that this day could come. Now he is walking through the consequences. There is no satisfaction in being proven right. And that is another thing that separates a prophet from someone who simply wants to win an argument. Jeremiah mourns for the city, because a warning coming true is still a tragedy. And while Jerusalem burns, something extraordinary is happening hundreds of miles to the east. Among the people taken in the earlier deportations lives another man, Ezekiel. He also comes from a priestly family. But far from Jerusalem, there is no temple where he can serve as a priest. He lives among the exiles beside the canals of Babylon. And there he receives a vision. The heavens seem to open. Ezekiel sees strange creatures, wheels, fire, movement, and above it all, a manifestation of the glory of God. The vision is overwhelming. But behind all of its strange details is one enormous and simple revelation. God is there. The exiles might have believed that leaving Jerusalem meant leaving the presence of God behind. The temple was far away. The promised land was far away. But Ezekiel discovers that God's presence is not trapped inside Jerusalem. God can reach his people even in Babylon. And this begins the mission of one of the strangest prophets in the entire Bible. Ezekiel will not only speak, he will turn his own life into a series of signs. He will lie on one side for long periods of time. He will ration his food. He will build models of Jerusalem. He will perform actions that seem almost impossible to understand to the people watching him. Because the people have become so accustomed to ignoring words that now the message will have to become something they cannot easily forget. Ezekiel receives a responsibility that gives weight to every word he speaks. He is called a watchman. The image is simple. Imagine a man standing on a wall, looking toward the horizon while the rest of the city sleeps. If he sees an army approaching, he must sound the alarm. He cannot stop the enemy by himself. He cannot force anyone to get up. But he must warn them. If he remains silent, he has failed. If he gives the warning and no one listens, he has still fulfilled his responsibility even if the tragedy comes. Ezekiel has just received an almost perfect description of what so many prophets have been doing for generations. Watching, speaking, warning, even when no one wants to listen. And the exiles surrounding Ezekiel are still holding on to one hope. Jerusalem still exists. The temple is still there. Maybe those who were taken to Babylon were simply unfortunate. Maybe the people who remained in Judah are safe. But Ezekiel begins to tear that illusion apart. In one of his most disturbing visions, he is symbolically taken to Jerusalem. There he sees what is happening inside the place so many people still consider sacred. He sees idolatry. He sees practices that contradict everything the temple is supposed to represent. And then something happens that is even more serious than the arrival of an army. Ezekiel watches the glory of God begin to leave the temple. First it moves, then it stops. As though the departure is happening slowly. The presence that once filled that place in the days of Solomon is moving away. For a priest like Ezekiel, few images could be more devastating. The true disaster is not simply that Babylon might destroy a building. It is that the building can remain standing for a time while the very thing that made it sacred is already leaving. Ezekiel continues to announce the fall of Jerusalem. But one day he receives devastating news of his own. His wife will die. And he is commanded to make even this loss part of his message. Ezekiel loses the woman he describes as the delight of his eyes. And as he experiences that loss, Jerusalem is about to lose what its people consider the delight of their own eyes. The temple. Once again, the prophet's life becomes a sign. Then a survivor arrives from Jerusalem. He has traveled all the way from the destroyed city. He brings only a few words, but they are enough. The city has fallen. Now everything changes. For years, Ezekiel had spoken to people who could still imagine that the catastrophe might never happen. Now it has. The walls are destroyed. The temple has burned. The kingdom of Judah has come to an end. The warning has been fulfilled. And then something happens that takes us back to what we began to discover at the start of this story. The prophet keeps speaking, but the tone begins to change. Ezekiel begins to look toward what might exist after the ruins. He speaks about shepherds. Israel's former leaders had used the people for their own benefit. They had not cared for the weak. They had not searched for the lost. So God promises to intervene. He will search for his sheep. He will gather them. And he will place over them a shepherd connected to David. But how do you restore a people who have repeated the same failure for generations? Ezekiel takes the answer even further. God will give them a new heart, a new spirit. He will remove the heart of stone. The image comes remarkably close to what Jeremiah had already announced. Jeremiah spoke of a law written on the heart. Ezekiel speaks of replacing the heart itself. Two prophets, two different places, the same need. Israel's problem was never only Egypt, or Assyria, or Babylon. If the people returned to their land with the same heart, sooner or later they would build the same story all over again. Restoration would have to begin within. And then Ezekiel receives one of his most famous visions. He finds himself in a valley. There are no living soldiers around him. There are bones. So many bones. They are dry, scattered. We are not looking at a wounded army that might still recover. We are looking at something that has been dead for far too long. Then comes a question. Can these bones live again? From a human perspective, the answer seems obvious. No. But Ezekiel is commanded to prophesy. The bones begin to move. They come together. Tendons appear. Then flesh. Then skin. And finally, breath enters them. What had been a valley of death rises as a living multitude. The meaning is direct. The bones represent Israel. The people say their hope is gone, that everything is over. But God speaks of opening graves, of raising them up, of bringing them back. For the first time after so many warnings of destruction, an image of restoration seems almost as impossible as those warnings once seemed before they came true. And that changes our question. For generations, the prophets had asked what would happen if the people refused to listen. Now among the ruins, another question begins to emerge. What could God do with a people after they have already lost everything? The answer begins to appear precisely when Israel no longer has the strength to produce it on its own. For centuries, the prophets had called the people to return. Now the prophets begin to announce that God himself will have to bring them back. That difference is enormous, because the exile has revealed something. Changing kings is not enough. Surviving a war is not enough. Even rebuilding a city will not be enough. If the heart remains the same, the story will simply begin again. Ezekiel continues looking toward the future. After the valley of dry bones, he receives visions of reunification. Israel had been divided for centuries. North and south. Israel and Judah. Two kingdoms born from the same family and often fighting against each other. Ezekiel takes two sticks. One represents Judah. The other represents Joseph and the tribes of the north. He joins them together in his hand. Symbolically, they become one. The scattered people will be reunited. And over them appears a figure we already know, David. But David has been dead for centuries. Ezekiel is not simply saying that the ancient king will return to his palace. He is using David's name to point toward a future ruler, a shepherd, a king, someone under whose rule the people will finally live as one. The promise that seemed buried with the fall of Jerusalem begins to rise again among the exiles. Then comes an even greater vision. Ezekiel sees a temple. He describes it in extraordinary detail. Rooms, gates, measurements, courtyards. But the most important thing is not the architecture. It is what returns. The glory of God. The prophet who once watched God's presence leave Jerusalem now sees it coming back. The story of judgment begins to reverse. First, the glory departed. Now it returns. First, the people were driven away. Now restoration begins to appear. First, the land was left devastated. Now something begins to flow from the temple. Water. At first there is only a little. Ezekiel walks forward. The water reaches his ankles, then his knees, then his waist, until it becomes a river too deep to cross on foot. And wherever that river goes, life appears. Trees grow along its banks. Waters that were once dead are transformed. There are fish, fruit, healing. After chapters filled with destruction, Ezekiel ends by looking at a world coming back to life. And the final idea in his vision may be the most important of all. The city receives a name connected to a promise. The Lord is there. That was what the exile seemed to have destroyed. The possibility of once again living near the presence of God. But while Ezekiel sees restoration from Babylon, another kind of prophetic story begins inside the palaces of the empire. Daniel. Daniel belongs to a generation taken from Judah while he is still young. He is carried away to Babylon. There they try to give him a new education, a new language, even a new name. The empire does not simply want to control his body. It wants to redefine who he is. Daniel learns how to live within that world without allowing that world to completely determine his identity. And soon, something happens that brings him before the king. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. It troubles him deeply. But he does not simply want an interpretation. He demands that his wise men tell him what the dream itself was. No one can do it. What follows is brutal. The wise men are ordered to be killed. Daniel asks for time. He prays, and the mystery is revealed to him. The dream shows an enormous statue. A head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet made from a fragile mixture. Then a stone appears. It is not cut by human hands. It strikes the statue. The entire image is destroyed, and then the stone grows until it becomes something that fills the earth. Daniel explains that the statue represents kingdoms, human empires that rise and disappear. Babylon seems invincible while Daniel is living there, but it will not last. Neither will the powers that come after it. In the end, Daniel speaks of a different kingdom, one that will never be destroyed. Prophecy has changed in scale. The earliest messengers warned a king. Later prophets warned a nation. Now from the heart of a foreign empire, Daniel sees centuries of kingdoms rising and falling. And beyond all of them, another kingdom that remains. But before Daniel can understand how far that vision will reach, he will have to learn a dangerous truth. Empires do not only demand obedience. Sometimes they demand worship. Nebuchadnezzar builds an enormous statue of gold. Then he gathers officials from across the empire. The command is simple. When the music begins, everyone must bow down and worship the image. Anyone who refuses will be thrown into a blazing furnace. Daniel is not at the center of this story. Instead, 3 of his companions are the ones who must make the decision. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They could obey on the outside. They could bow down for a few seconds and continue believing in God in private. Most likely no one would ask anything more of them. But they refuse. They are brought before Nebuchadnezzar. The king gives them another chance. And then they respond with one of the most extraordinary declarations of the entire exile. God is able to rescue them. But even if he does not, they will not worship the statue. That last part changes everything. They do not obey because they are guaranteed a miracle. They obey even while accepting the possibility that they may die. Nebuchadnezzar orders the furnace to be made even hotter. The 3 men are tied up. They are thrown inside. But when the king looks into the furnace, he rises in astonishment. They had thrown in 3 men. Now he sees 4. And the men who should be dead are walking through the flames. When they come out, the fire has not consumed them. The empire tried to decide what they were allowed to worship. And it discovered that there is a limit to its authority. The years continue. Kings rise. Kings disappear. And Daniel remains. His life becomes a quiet demonstration of what he had already seen in the vision of the statue. Empires seem permanent when you are living inside them. Until suddenly they are not. One night, King Belshazzar holds an enormous feast. He uses the vessels that had been taken from the temple in Jerusalem. Objects that once belonged to worship are now being used in an imperial celebration. Then a hand appears. It writes on the wall. The celebration stops. No one understands the words. Daniel is called. And once again he must do what prophets have been doing for generations. Tell a powerful man something he does not want to hear. His kingdom has been weighed. It has been found wanting. And it is about to end. That very night, Babylon falls. The empire that destroyed Jerusalem. The empire that burned the temple. The empire that seemed powerful enough to decide the fate of entire nations. Falls. Daniel outlives the empire that carried him into captivity. But the arrival of a new power does not remove the danger. Under another government, Daniel continues to pray as he always has. Some officials use that habit against him. They arrange for a law to be passed that turns his prayers into a crime. Daniel knows what this means. But he still opens his windows. He prays. And he is arrested. This time there is no furnace. There is a den of lions. Daniel is thrown inside. A stone closes the entrance. And once again an empire seems to have the final word. Until the next morning. Daniel is still alive. The lions have not destroyed him. But Daniel's story does not end with his survival. As he grows older, his visions become increasingly strange. He sees beasts rising from the sea. Creatures representing violent powers. Kingdoms that no longer look like magnificent statues, but like animals that devour. The change is revealing. From a human perspective, empires can look glorious. Gold, silver, bronze, iron. From another perspective they can look like beasts. But then Daniel sees a different scene. Thrones are set in place. A judge appears. And before him comes someone described as a son of man. He receives dominion, glory, a kingdom. And unlike the kingdoms that came before, his dominion does not disappear. Generations pass. Empires change. But Daniel sees a kingdom that will never be handed over to the next conqueror. Here, prophetic hope begins to reach far beyond simply returning to Jerusalem. Yes, the people may return. Yes, the city may be rebuilt. But what good would it do to return home if another empire simply rose afterward? Assyria had fallen. Babylon had fallen too. Others would take their place. If restoration meant nothing more than replacing one human kingdom with another, the story would never end. Daniel begins to look toward something different. A kingdom unlike the others. A dominion that does not disappear. A victory that does not simply depend on who has the strongest army. And with that, the exile has completely transformed the voice of the prophets. Before the catastrophe, they asked how long Israel could continue refusing to listen. After the catastrophe, the question is different. How can something that has already been destroyed ever be restored? Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant. Ezekiel spoke of a new heart. Daniel sees a kingdom that will have no end. The pieces are still separate. None of them fully explains how it will happen. But something has changed. The prophets are no longer looking only toward the next disaster. They are looking much further ahead. And soon, for the first time in generations, some of the exiles will receive news that once seemed impossible. They can return to Jerusalem. The return begins with a decision made by a foreign king. Cyrus of Persia has conquered Babylon, and he allows the peoples displaced by the former empire to return to their lands and rebuild their places of worship. For the Jewish exiles, this means something many of them have waited decades to see. Jerusalem is within reach again. Some families return. Others remain in the cities where they have already built new lives. Those who make the journey find something very different from the city their parents and grandparents remembered. There are ruins, broken walls, homes that no longer exist, and the temple that once stood at the center of Jerusalem is gone. But they are back. They begin with the altar. Then they lay the foundations of a new temple. And when those foundations are completed, something unusual happens. Some people celebrate. Others weep. The younger generation sees a beginning. The older generation remembers what stood there before. The sounds blend together until it becomes difficult to tell the weeping from the celebration. Perhaps no image captures the return from exile better than this one. The promise is being fulfilled, but not in the glorious way many might have imagined. The people have returned, and yet they still live under the authority of another empire. Jerusalem exists again, but there is no king from the house of David ruling as before. The temple is rising, but the great promises of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel seem much larger than anything standing before them. And soon another problem appears. The rebuilding stops. Years pass. People begin focusing on their own homes. The temple remains unfinished. Then two prophets appear, Haggai and Zechariah. Haggai looks at the priorities of the people. He asks why their own homes receive so much attention while the house of God remains in ruins. His message is direct. They have physically returned to Jerusalem. But returning to a place does not necessarily mean restoring what was lost. The people respond. Construction begins again. And Haggai delivers a surprising promise. This temple may seem small compared with the one that stood before it, but its future glory will be greater. For those who remember the magnificence of Solomon's temple, that must be difficult to imagine. Zechariah receives visions instead. Many of them are strange. Horses, horns, a flying scroll, a lampstand, olive trees. Images that seem to move between the world the people know and something still far in the future. But one figure begins to stand out. Zerubbabel. He is the governor, and he belongs to the line of David. That matters, because after the fall of Jerusalem, the dynasty seemed to have disappeared from history. Now a descendant of David is taking part in the rebuilding. But Zerubbabel is not a king. The monarchy has not been fully restored. The promise is still alive, but it is still waiting. Zechariah also speaks of another figure, a king who will come to Jerusalem. But he does not appear like the conquerors the world has come to know. He does not enter surrounded by the military power of an empire. He comes humbly, riding on a donkey. The image remains suspended somewhere in the future. Then another unsettling vision appears. A shepherd is rejected. 30 pieces of silver are mentioned. Later, Zechariah speaks of someone who will be pierced. The images do not yet form a complete explanation, but prophecy has changed again. After the exile, the messengers are no longer simply saying that the people must rebuild what Babylon destroyed. They are looking toward something the rebuilding of Jerusalem cannot accomplish on its own. A king still has to come. A shepherd still has to appear. Something still has to happen before the ancient promises can reach their true fulfillment. Eventually, the temple is completed. The sacrifices return. The ceremonies return. Jerusalem comes back to life. But if you had walked through its streets during those years, you would have noticed something missing. There is no David on the throne. Persia still rules. And the great restoration announced by the prophets still seems incomplete. The people had hoped to return. They returned. They had hoped to rebuild. They rebuilt. And still something was missing. Then the prophetic voice begins to ask one final question. Not simply when Jerusalem will be restored, but what kind of restoration could finally prevent the entire story from repeating itself? Because after Moses, after Samuel, after Elijah, after Isaiah, after Jeremiah, after the fall and the exile, one truth should now be impossible to ignore. Israel had never suffered from a lack of warnings. They had received generations of them. The problem went much deeper. And the final prophets of the Old Testament will begin to speak directly to that problem. One of those final prophets is Malachi, and the world he finds is deeply revealing. The temple is standing again. The sacrifices have returned. The priests are back in their places. From the outside, many of the things destroyed by the exile seem to have been restored. But Malachi looks closer, and he discovers that the old problem is still there. The priests offer defective animals. They are willing to place on the altar what they would never dare offer to a human governor. The ceremonies continue. But the reverence those ceremonies were meant to represent is beginning to disappear. The people are also beginning to wonder what the point of remaining faithful really is. They look around. They see injustice. They see arrogant people prospering. And some begin to wonder whether there is any real difference between obeying and refusing to obey. It is a strangely familiar situation. Israel has returned from exile, but returning to the land has not automatically brought their hearts back with them. Babylon could carry a person far away from Jerusalem, but returning to Jerusalem could not remove everything that had led the people to Babylon in the first place. Then Malachi returns to the language of the earlier prophets. God will come, but before he comes, a messenger will appear. Someone will prepare the way. And then comes an even more specific reference. Elijah. The prophet who centuries earlier had asked Israel how long they would continue wavering between two sides now becomes a figure of expectation. Malachi announces that before a great day still to come, someone connected to the mission of Elijah will appear. And then the Old Testament reaches a strange place. It does not end with every promise fulfilled. It ends waiting. The temple exists, but the glory described by Ezekiel still seems greater than anything the people can see. The descendants of David still exist. But none of them sits on an independent throne in Jerusalem. The people have returned. But the new heart announced by the prophets still seems to belong to the future. And the empires continue to rule. Persia will not last forever. Daniel had already warned that human kingdoms would continue to change. Then Greece will come. Alexander the Great will extend his rule with extraordinary speed. After his death, his empire will divide. And the land of Israel will find itself caught between rival powers. In time, one of the most traumatic crises of this period will arrive. A ruler named Antiochus IV will attempt to impose practices that directly attack Jewish religious identity. The temple will be desecrated. Resistance will erupt. The Maccabean family will lead a revolt. For a time, the Jewish people will regain a measure of independence. But that will not last either. Eventually, Rome will extend its power over the region. Another empire. Another foreign power. Another generation of Jerusalem waiting. And through all of these changes, something happens that makes the silence feel even deeper. No new prophetic figure appears with the authority of Isaiah or Jeremiah to explain each crisis. The ancient words remain. They are read. They are copied. They are remembered. But the generations continue to pass. Imagine growing up in that world, hearing the stories of Moses from childhood, of Samuel, of Elijah, Knowing there was once a time when prophets walked into the presence of kings and spoke words that could change the destiny of a nation. Reading that Jeremiah had promised a new covenant. That Ezekiel had spoken of a new heart. That Daniel had seen a kingdom that would never be destroyed. That Zechariah had announced the arrival of a humble king. And then looking around you. Rome is still there. Foreign soldiers still walk through the land. Herod rules beneath the shadow of Roman power. The promises seem enormous. The reality seems much smaller. But the silence does not mean those words have disappeared. Quite the opposite. The longer the people wait, the more weight those words begin to carry. The question is no longer simply what a prophet said. The question is when it will happen. When will that king come? When will the messenger appear? When will the people truly be restored? When will the kingdom Daniel saw finally arrive? And then, after generations of waiting for a recognizable prophetic voice, a man appears in the wilderness. He is not inside the temple. He does not belong to a palace. He does not dress like an important official. His entire way of life deliberately recalls another ancient figure, Elijah. And his message begins with a word the prophets had repeated for centuries: return. His name is John. And with him, something extraordinary happens. The long history of prophetic warnings does not simply begin again in the same way. Because John does not appear merely to announce another invasion. He says that someone is coming after him. Someone greater. After centuries of asking why God continued sending messenger after messenger, we are about to discover who they had been preparing the way for. John appears beside the Jordan River. And the location matters. Centuries earlier, Israel had crossed those waters to enter the Promised Land. Now people from Jerusalem and the surrounding regions are coming out to the river to hear a man telling them that they need to begin again. He is not speaking primarily to pagans. He is speaking to the people of Israel themselves. And that makes his message uncomfortable. Because many people could look toward Rome and believe that the great problem was somewhere outside of them. A foreign empire controlled the land. Roman soldiers were present. Their rulers depended on Roman power. It seemed reasonable to expect God to deal with that problem first. John looks in a different direction. Inward. The people need to repent. They need to produce fruit that shows real change. And John warns them that being descendants of Abraham cannot be used as an automatic guarantee. Once again we hear the echo of the ancient prophets. Amos had said that religious ceremonies could not hide injustice. Jeremiah had said that the temple could not become a refuge for people who refused to change their lives. Malachi had confronted priests who continued offering sacrifices even after losing sight of what those sacrifices were supposed to mean. Now John continues the same message. Being close to sacred things is not enough. Belonging to the right people is not enough. Something has to change. But John adds a special sense of urgency. He speaks as though the moment people have been waiting for across generations is now extremely close. The axe is already at the root. Judgment is approaching. And someone is coming after him. John baptizes with water. The one who is coming will do something greater. So when Jesus appears, the story of the prophets reaches a remarkable turning point. John sees him approaching. And he recognizes that the person he has been directing everyone's attention toward is finally standing before him. The messenger has found the one whose way he was sent to prepare. But that does not mean John immediately understands everything that will happen. And that part of his story is deeply human. John continues to condemn what he believes is wrong. Even when the person involved is Herod Antipas. Herod has taken Herodias as his wife after she had been married to his brother. John publicly condemns it. Once again, a prophet confronts a ruler. Samuel before Saul. Nathan before David. Elijah before Ahab. Isaiah before the kings of Judah. Jeremiah before the final rulers of Jerusalem. And now John before Herod. Centuries have passed. The danger remains the same. Herod has him arrested. John ends up in prison. The man who once preached in the open wilderness is now locked inside a cell. And from there he begins hearing reports about Jesus. But perhaps some things are not happening the way John expected. The judgment he announced does not seem to arrive immediately. Rome still rules. Herod is still in his palace. John is still inside a prison cell. So he sends a question. Are you really the one who was supposed to come? It is an extraordinary question coming from him. The man who prepared the way now needs reassurance that he did not misunderstand where that way was leading. Jesus does not simply answer yes. Instead, he points to what is happening. The blind can see. Those who could not walk are walking again. The sick are being restored. The deaf can hear. The dead are being raised. And the poor are hearing good news. The answer is built from the language of the ancient prophets, especially Isaiah. It is almost as though Jesus is saying, look again at the words you already know. Look at what the prophet said would happen. Then look at what is happening now. John will have to trust from inside his prison. He will not be rescued by a miracle. Herodias continues to hold a grudge against him. During a celebration, a request forces Herod to make a decision, and John is executed. His head is brought into the palace. The last great prophet who directly prepared the way ends like so many messengers before him. He says something a ruler does not want to hear, and he pays for it. But John also marks a transition, because the man who comes after him does not fit easily into a single category. Jesus speaks like a prophet. He warns. He exposes hypocrisy. He announces judgment. He weeps over Jerusalem. He speaks of destruction that may come. But at the same time, he does something that forces the people around him to ask who he really is. The prophets before him would say, "This is what God says." Jesus often speaks with an authority that seems to place the full weight directly on his own words. And little by little, an unavoidable question begins to emerge. After centuries of sending messengers, what happens when the message no longer comes simply through another prophet? That question changes the way we see everything that has happened up to this point, because Jesus does not enter an empty story. He arrives after centuries of voices. Moses had spoken of a prophet who would come. Isaiah had described good news for the poor, freedom for the captives, and restoration for the broken. Jeremiah had announced a new covenant. Ezekiel had spoken of a shepherd, a new heart, and a restored presence. Daniel had seen someone like a son of man receiving a kingdom that would never disappear. And John has just pointed toward Jesus. The ancient words are beginning to come together. But Jesus also continues doing the very thing that had made the lives of so many prophets dangerous. He speaks when silence would be easier. He enters synagogues. He teaches before crowds. He sits with people others have rejected. And when he encounters religious systems that have lost sight of what they were meant to represent, he confronts them. On one occasion he enters the temple. He sees merchants, money changers. An entire system of activity has taken over a space connected with worship. Jesus intervenes. Tables are overturned. Coins fall to the ground. And his words echo the prophets directly. Isaiah had spoken of a house of prayer. Jeremiah had warned against turning the temple into a refuge for people who lived in opposition to what God required. Now those ancient messages are heard again inside the same place. And it produces a familiar reaction. The authorities begin asking how they can stop him. The pattern seems to be repeating itself. The message confronts. Those in power feel threatened. And the messenger becomes the problem. Jesus also speaks about Jerusalem. And here the story takes on an especially painful tone. Because the city has been through this before. Jeremiah had walked through its streets warning that the temple could fall. Most people refused to believe him. Babylon came. The walls were destroyed. The temple burned. Centuries later, the building has been raised again. Jerusalem is once more filled with pilgrims. And Jesus announces destruction again. He says a time will come when what they are looking at will be torn down. For anyone who knows the history, those words must be deeply unsettling. Again. After everything that happened, after the exile, after the return, after generations of waiting for restoration, can Jerusalem really repeat the same pattern? Jesus weeps over the city. He does not speak like someone who takes satisfaction in the possibility of judgment. The scene recalls Jeremiah. The warning also hurts the one who delivers it. Then Jesus uses an image that brings centuries of prophetic history together. He speaks of Jerusalem as a city that kills the prophets and rejects those sent to it. The accusation is enormous, because it places his own generation inside a much longer story. The problem did not begin with them. For centuries, God had sent messengers. Some were ignored. Others were persecuted. Others were threatened. Some were killed. And now Jesus tells a story that carries that pattern to its conclusion. A landowner plants a vineyard. He prepares it. Then he leaves it in the care of tenants. When the time comes to receive what belongs to him, he sends servants. The tenants beat one. They reject another. They kill another. The owner sends more. The same thing happens. The pattern is difficult to miss. Messenger after messenger. Warning after warning. Rejection after rejection. Then the owner makes one final decision. He will send his son. Perhaps they will respect the son. But when the tenants see him, they understand who he is, the heir, and they decide to kill him. The story becomes an accusation. But it also gives us part of the answer to our question. What happens after centuries of sending prophets? In the story Jesus tells, after the servants comes the son. And soon afterward, what seemed like a parable begins to look like a description of what is happening around him. The opposition grows. The leaders look for a way to arrest him. One of his own disciples agrees to betray him. Jesus is brought before the religious authorities, then before Roman power. And once again, we see a man who has spoken uncomfortable words standing before those who have the authority to condemn him. But this time, the story of the prophet seems to have reached a point from which it cannot return. Because if Jesus really is the one John was pointing toward, if the ancient promises are converging on him, then the question is no longer why Israel rejected so many messengers. The question is what will happen when they also reject the one who came after them. The death of Jesus could seem like the darkest possible ending to the story of the prophets. For generations, God had sent messenger after messenger. Now the one John had pointed toward has been crucified. And for a few hours, everything seems to confirm the same old pattern. Power has silenced the uncomfortable voice once again. Rome still holds its authority. The leaders who wanted Jesus dead are still alive. His followers scatter. And his body is placed inside a tomb. If the story ended there, we could look back and find a deeply bitter conclusion. Moses spoke and Israel rebelled. Samuel spoke and the kings disobeyed. Elijah spoke and Jezebel wanted him dead. Amos spoke and they tried to drive him away. Jeremiah spoke and they beat him before throwing him into a cistern. John spoke and Herod executed him. Jesus spoke and ended up on a cross. Messenger after messenger. Generation after generation. The same rejection. But the story does not end in the tomb. On the third day, the women who come to the burial place find the stone rolled away. The body is gone. And the disciples, who had gone from hope to fear in a matter of hours, begin making a claim that will completely transform the way they understand everything that has happened. Jesus is alive. The cross had not proven his message false. And it had not brought his message to an end. Then something important happens for the story we have been following. Jesus directs the attention of his followers back toward the prophets. What has just happened is not meant to be understood as an unexpected accident. The ancient writings had been preparing the language needed to understand it. Suffering, rejection, death, restoration, kingdom. Pieces that had seemed separate for centuries begin to come together. But another transformation is taking place. Until now, our story has followed mostly men who were sent to Israel. Now the message begins moving from Israel toward the nations. The disciples receive a mission. They will have to carry what they have seen far beyond Jerusalem. And that means the ancient problem of the prophets will continue as well. Because carrying a message does not guarantee that the world will want to hear it. Very soon, the first followers of Jesus discover something Moses, Elijah, and Jeremiah would have understood immediately. Speaking can come at a cost. Stephen stands before the religious leaders. He looks back through the history of Israel, and he makes a painful accusation. Their ancestors had resisted again and again those whom God sent to them. They had persecuted the prophets. And now Stephen says the same pattern has happened again. His words provoke fury. They drag him outside the city, and they stone him to death. The first major account of a Christian messenger being killed after Jesus feels like a direct continuation of the ancient prophetic story. But this time something is different. Killing the messenger does not stop the message from spreading. Persecution scatters the believers. And as they scatter, they carry with them the very message their enemies were trying to silence. Pressure creates movement. Jerusalem is no longer the only center. The message reaches other regions. Then another man enters the story. At first, he stands with the persecutors. So, he is there when Stephen dies. He approves of what happened. Then he begins persecuting the followers of Jesus himself. He enters homes. He arrests people. He tries to stop the movement. If you had watched his story at that moment, you probably would have assumed Saul would be remembered as one of the great enemies of the message. Then, on the road to Damascus, everything changes. A light brings him to the ground. The voice he hears confronts him. And the persecutor becomes a messenger. Few stories capture more clearly how unpredictable the pattern has now become. The man who tried to silence the message will now suffer in order to carry it. He will be beaten, imprisoned, driven out of cities. He will survive shipwreck. He will stand before authorities. And he will continue speaking. The story of the prophets has not ended. It has changed in scale. For centuries, a voice would rise within Israel and say one thing: listen. Now those voices begin crossing borders. And the question that has followed us through this entire story begins crossing those borders with them. What will the world do when the message that so many within Israel rejected begins to reach them? The message leaves Jerusalem. It crosses regions and enters cities where the stories of Abraham, Moses, and David are barely known. And every new place presents the same challenge. How do you explain a story built across centuries to people who did not grow up hearing it? Paul learns to do this in different ways. When he speaks in a synagogue, he can begin with Israel. He can remind people of the promises, the kings, the prophets, and he can show how those ancient expectations lead toward Jesus. But when he enters places where that language is unfamiliar, he has to begin much earlier. In Athens, he walks through a city filled with altars. He observes its religious images. He listens to its philosophers. And when he finally speaks, he does not begin by assuming that everyone knows Moses. He begins with God as creator, with humanity, with the human search for God. And from there, he leads them toward the message he has come to announce. The approach changes. The center remains the same. Something similar had happened with the ancient prophets. Amos spoke about injustice to a prosperous society. Hosea turned a broken relationship into an image of Israel's unfaithfulness. Ezekiel used strange actions among the exiles. Daniel spoke from within foreign empires. The messenger has to enter the world of the people who are listening. But he cannot change the message simply to make it comfortable. And Paul quickly discovers where resistance begins. In Philippi, he is beaten and imprisoned. In other cities, crowds turn against him. In Ephesus, his preaching begins to affect people whose businesses depend on the religious worship of the city. Then a riot breaks out. Once again, we encounter an ancient truth. Messages become especially dangerous when they threaten something people believe they need to protect. For Pharaoh, it was his control over the slaves. For Ahab and Jezebel, it was a religious system tied to political power. For some of the leaders in Jerusalem, it was the order they already knew. And for certain people in Ephesus, there were economic interests at stake as well. The centuries change. The names change. But listening still has a cost. Eventually, Paul is arrested. He is brought before governors, before authorities. He has to defend himself. And eventually he appeals to Caesar. His journey takes him toward Rome, the capital of the same empire that had executed Jesus. Only a few decades earlier, the image would have seemed almost impossible to imagine. A Jewish man from a small province arrives at the heart of Roman power carrying a message about a crucified king. He has no army, no territory, no royal court. He arrives as a prisoner. And still he speaks. Once again, the story has overturned our expectations. Empires seem to hold the messengers under their control. But the messengers continue carrying words that outlive the empires themselves. Assyria disappeared. Babylon disappeared. Persia lost its power. Greece was divided. Now Rome seems eternal. Daniel would have recognized the pattern. Human kingdoms appear. They rise. They seem impossible to move. And eventually they pass away. But as the first Christians carry their message throughout the Roman world, the ancient prophetic voices continue to be read. They are not abandoned as relics from another age. They become a way of understanding what is happening. The words of Joel help explain the coming of the Spirit. The Psalms and the prophets help the early believers understand the death and resurrection of Jesus. Isaiah appears again and again. Jeremiah, Daniel, Hosea, Zechariah. Voices separated by generations begin to form a conversation stretching across centuries. And then we begin to understand something. The prophets were never speaking only to the people standing in front of them. Their messages were born within specific moments. A war, a king, an injustice, an invasion, an exile. But some of their words survived the moments that produced them. Isaiah died. His words continued speaking. Jeremiah watched Jerusalem fall. His words survived the rebuilding of the city. Daniel lived under empires that no longer exist. His visions continued to be read by generations living under entirely different powers. The messenger disappears. The message remains. And perhaps that is one reason the story of the prophets is so remarkable. Many of them never fully saw the things they announced. They spoke of restorations that would come long after their own lives were over, of kings they would never meet, of a new covenant whose fullness they themselves would never live to see. They had to speak without always receiving the satisfaction of seeing how the story would end. But even after Jesus, part of that expectation remains open. Injustice has not disappeared. Empires still exist. Death remains. The world still does not fully resemble the images of restoration Ezekiel once saw. And then the Bible does something deeply fitting. After centuries of prophets looking toward the future, its final great book looks toward the future once again. And there, many of those ancient images return one more time. Revelation begins with messages addressed to specific communities, real cities, real people, churches facing different problems. Some have endured. Others have grown comfortable. Some are suffering persecution. Others appear strong from the outside but are slowly losing the very things they were meant to protect. And suddenly, the final book of the Bible begins to sound strangely familiar. Once again there are warnings. Once again there are calls to listen. Once again there is a choice between remaining faithful and turning away. After everything we have seen throughout this story, perhaps that should no longer surprise us. The question is still the same. Will they listen? But the visions of Revelation soon expand far beyond those individual communities. Thrones appear. Beasts, kingdoms, conflict, judgment. And if you have followed this story from Daniel, some of these images will feel familiar. Daniel had seen beasts rising from the sea. He had watched human powers take the form of violent creatures. He had seen empires rise and disappear. Now those images return. Not because history is simply repeating itself, but because the same problem continues to take new forms. Empires change their names. The temptation of power remains. And standing against those beasts is another figure, a lamb. The image seems weak. A lamb is not what you would expect to place against monsters and kingdoms. But this lamb appears as one who was slain and still stands. Once again, victory takes a form the powerful do not understand. And around him appears a multitude. People from different nations, different languages, different peoples. What for centuries seemed centered around Israel has now spread far beyond it. But Revelation does not forget the warnings. It speaks of systems that seduce, of powers that demand loyalty, of wealth capable of convincing a society that it could never fall. And then Babylon appears. Not simply the ancient city where Daniel and Ezekiel once lived. Babylon becomes an image, a way of speaking about power, luxury, violence, and arrogance. And once again we hear the echo of the prophets. Amos had walked among prosperous people who refused to look at the injustice beneath their wealth. Isaiah had seen the pride of nations. Jeremiah had announced the fall of a city that believed itself secure. Daniel had told kings that their empires would not last. Now all of those voices seem to come together in one final warning. No human power should ever be mistaken for something eternal. Babylon falls. And when it falls, those who became wealthy through it watch from a distance. What once seemed permanent disappears. The scene could belong to almost any prophetic age. But this time, the story continues toward something the ancient messengers could only glimpse from far away. A world where the warning will never need to be repeated again. That idea is almost difficult to imagine. Because ever since Moses, we have been living inside a pattern. God speaks. The people listen for a time. Then they forget. Another prophet comes. The message returns. There is repentance. Then another generation turns away again. Samuel had to speak after Moses. Elijah after Samuel. Amos and Hosea after Elijah. Then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and many others. Every generation seemed to need another voice saying the same things. Remember, return, listen. But Jeremiah had announced something different. A law written on the heart. Ezekiel had spoken of a new heart and a new spirit. The prophets had already understood that a final restoration would have to reach deeper than another warning. And now, in these final visions, we begin to see the destination toward which those promises had been moving. A new creation. A city where God dwells with humanity. Death disappears. Pain does not remain forever. Everything that once created separation begins to pass away. Even Ezekiel's river seems to return, a river of life, trees, healing, presence. Ezekiel had seen water flowing from the temple and carrying life into places that had been dead. Now that image reaches its final form. But there is an extraordinary difference. There is no need for a temple. The presence of God is no longer contained within a building. There is no city trying to protect a sacred place while its heart drifts away from everything that place was meant to represent. The distance is gone. And now we can understand why the story of the prophets was never simply a story about men who could predict the future. It was the story of a conversation humanity interrupted again and again. God spoke. His messengers warned. And people had to decide whether they would listen. For centuries, it almost always seemed necessary to send another voice. But if these final promises are truly fulfilled, something fundamental changes. There will be no need for another Elijah standing before Ahab. No other Jeremiah weeping over a city that refuses to listen. No other Ezekiel standing watch from the wall. Because the great question that followed every one of them will finally have found its answer. And perhaps now we can finally answer the question we began with. How many times can God warn a people before allowing the very thing he has been warning about for generations to happen? The story of the prophets has given us an uncomfortable answer. Many times. More times than anyone might have expected. Before Samaria fell, there were warnings. Before Jerusalem burned, there were warnings. Before the people were carried into exile, there were years when they still had the opportunity to return. One voice disappeared, and another took its place. A king died, and the message continued. One generation forgot, and someone came to remind them of what their parents had already heard. But eventually the consequences came. Not because there had never been an opportunity to change. They came after many opportunities had been rejected. And that helps us understand something that may have been easy to miss at the beginning. The prophets were not sent simply to announce disasters. If that had been their only purpose, it would have been enough to pronounce the judgment and wait for it to happen. But the prophets kept speaking. They returned. They warned again. They wept. They interceded. They pleaded. Because as long as the prophet was still speaking, there was still an opportunity to listen. That is why Jeremiah wept when Jerusalem fell. That is why Elijah continued even after he felt defeated. That is why Hosea could still speak of love in the middle of unfaithfulness. The prophet was not simply the man who knew something terrible was going to happen. He was the man sent before it was too late. But then came the exile. And that is where the great turning point in our story took place. What the prophets had warned about finally happened. Israel fell. Judah fell. Jerusalem was destroyed. The temple burned. And the prophets kept speaking. Perhaps that is the most important part of all. Because after the ruins, the message did not end. It changed. Jeremiah spoke of a new covenant. Ezekiel spoke of a new heart. Daniel spoke of a kingdom that would never disappear. Zechariah spoke of a king who was still to come. Malachi spoke of a messenger who would prepare the way. Prophecy began as a warning. And little by little, it also became a promise. Then John appeared. And he pointed toward Jesus. That is when the ancient messages began to come together. The king. The shepherd. The kingdom. The new covenant. The restoration. Words spoken by men separated by centuries began to form a story much greater than any of their individual lives. And perhaps that is why it is far too simple to remember the prophets only as men who predicted future events. Their lives were much more difficult than that. Moses was afraid to speak. Samuel had to condemn the king he had personally anointed. Elijah ended up exhausted beneath a tree. Jeremiah wished he could remain silent. Ezekiel turned his own pain into a message. John ended up inside a prison. These were not men calmly observing the future from a distance. They were living inside the very crises they had been called to speak about. And many of them never lived to see the outcome. They simply had to remain faithful to the message they had been given. Perhaps that is the most human part of their entire story. Speaking without knowing who will listen. Warning without knowing whether anyone will change. Planting a word whose result may only be seen by another generation. And continuing anyway. Because from the first messenger to the final pages of the Bible, one idea remains. The voice can be rejected. It can be ridiculed. It can be persecuted. The messenger can even disappear. But the word continues moving forward. It passed through palaces, deserts, wars, exiles, empires, prisons, and entire generations. until it reached us. And perhaps after hearing the full story of the prophets, the final question should no longer be how many times God spoke before the consequences came. Perhaps it should be something else. When a warning has crossed centuries to reach us, will we recognize it while there is still time to listen?